They asked for backup. What they got were Deathworlders. The signal came in at 3:14 station time, and it was already too late for whoever sent it. I was sitting in the back of Patrol Runner 7, with my boots unlaced and a cold cup of coffee balanced on my knee when the alert cut through every speaker on the base at once. Not a siren, not a klaxon. Just a voice, flat, mechanical, the kind the translation systems used when they were not fully sure what they were translating. Incoming distress. Frequency, Origin Terran Coalition Relay. Beacon Sector 11, message repeating. Priority unclassified. Reason for unclassified status, origin. Species not on recognized contact list. My name is Yev Kalashnik, Sergeant. United Species Expeditionary Force, 9th. Rapid Response Division. I've been stationed on Lunar Outpost Bravo 7 for 14 months, which is a polite way of saying I have been sitting on a cold gray rock doing patrol sweeps of terrain that nothing had ever tried to cross. Nothing ever came to Bravo 7. It was the kind of posting they gave soldiers who were technically excellent but personally inconvenient to their commanding officers. I had questioned a colonel's decision in front of witnesses 8 months ago, and the colonel had been right about one thing and wrong about 4 others, and I had pointed that out with a level of directness that he had apparently found memorable. So Bravo 7. Cold, quiet, a posting that tested patience more than anything else. I laced up my boots. By the time I reached the communications hub, every officer above the rank of lieutenant was already crowded around the main console. Captain Orlan Marsh stood at the center with his arms folded, listening to the same message loop over and over. The translation kept breaking apart in the same places, like a sentence with words missing from the middle. Tor Turden. Coalition collapses, primary fleet annihilated, requesting any surviving species capable of untranslatable backup. Breath Dominion advance continues. All Accord members advised to untranslatable or evacuate. Turden. Coalition collapses, primary fleet annihilated. What is the untranslatable? Someone asked from the back. Lieutenant Dara Finn, our signals officer, did not look up from her console. She was a precise woman from Auckland who had studied Zen linguistics before joining the USCF, and she had the particular focused look she always got when a language problem was resisting her. The AI says the first one is a concept that does not have a direct match in any human language. Closest it can get is something like willingness to enter a situation with no guaranteed exit for the benefit of others you have no prior obligation to. The room was quiet for a moment. So it means brave, someone said. No, Finn said. Brave implies you are scared but you go anyway. This word apparently does not have fear in it at all. It is more like the question of fear simply does not occur to the person making the decision. I thought about that. What is the second untranslatable? Marsh asked. Finn looked at her screen. For a moment, the AI's best guess is something like the act of choosing to remain in the presence of danger for reasons that are not self-interested. But it says the cultural weight behind it is much heavier than that. It might be closer to something like honor, but honor with the expectation of cost built in from the beginning. The room was very quiet now. Captain Marsh turned around and looked at all of us. He was not a dramatic man. He did not give speeches. He had grown up in Nottingham and had been in the USCAF for 19 years, and had the kind of face that told you everything was being assessed without giving you any indication of what conclusion was being reached, he said. Command is patching us through to General Counsel in 4 minutes. I need everyone who is not essential to immediate base operations in the briefing room in 3. That was how it started, not with a parade or a declaration or a president standing at a podium in front of cameras, just a cold cup of coffee, a crackling signal from a part of space we barely knew existed, and a captain who needed people in a room in 3 minutes. I should tell you a little about where I come from, because it matters to everything that follows. Earth is not a gentle planet. It never has been, and it did not become one simply because one species on its surface developed the capacity for space travel. The part of it where I grew up, a stretch of eastern Russia where winter lasted 8 months and the permafrost went down 60 m, and the nearest town of any size required 2 hours of travel on a good road, did not teach me that the universe was kind. It taught me that cold was a constant, that distance was something to be crossed rather than surrendered to, and that the only real failure was stopping when stopping was a choice. My grandmother told me once that her grandmother had survived a famine and a war in the same decade and had still managed to plant a garden in the spring. After the war ended, I asked her why her grandmother had bothered with the garden. Given everything, she shrugged and said, what else was there to do? That was in every sense a very human answer. Not inspiring in a way that speeches are inspiring, just practical and stubborn, and quietly refusing to let the worst thing that had happened be the last thing. The Galactic Accord had admitted humanity 41 years before I was born. We had made contact with the Turdan Coalition's outer survey drones almost by accident. One of our deep space probes had drifted into a corridor we did not know was a designated travel lane, and a Turdan vessel had stopped to investigate the strange little machine floating in the dark and broadcasting greetings in 40 languages and playing recordings of whale song. The first contact meeting between a Turdan delegation and an Earth diplomatic team happened 7 months later on a station at the edge of what both sides were calling neutral territory, and by all accounts it was polite, careful, and thoroughly confusing to everyone present. Accord accepted us 6 years later after a debate that I have always found worth reading. The records of that debate were eventually translated and shared with Earth's academic community, and the reign of opinion expressed about humanity was striking. The species arguing most strongly against our admission used phrases like biologically overbuilt for their environment and demonstrating persistent aggressive adaptation patterns inconsistent with stable diplomatic behavior. The species arguing in our favor called us creative, highly motivated, and possessed a remarkable cooperative instincts when sufficiently unified. Both positions were, as far as I could tell, accurate. The Accord admitted us on a provisional basis with a monitoring period of 15 years. After 15 years, the monitoring period expired and was quietly not renewed because the humans in the Accord had spent those years attending meetings, signing agreements, and not doing anything that warranted continued supervision. We were a minor member. Everyone was polite about it, the way people are polite to the new neighbor whose house is slightly untidy and whose dog barks at odd hours, but who has not actually done anything wrong. We attended summits. We contributed small contingents to joint patrols and sent observers to council sessions and maintained diplomatic offices on 4 Accord hub stations. Nobody had ever called on us for anything that required more than the kind of quiet, competent background participation that minor members were expected to provide. Our planet, incidentally, was listed in the Accord's official registry as a Class 4 death world, a designation reserved for planets with extreme temperature variance across the surface, high baseline radiation environments, multiple apex predator species across different ecological zones, and biospheres that were, in the registries, careful language, actively hostile to most known sapient life forms. The Accord's Xenobiological Division had apparently spent considerable time documenting the ways in which Earth tried to injure or consume the things that lived on it, and their conclusion was that a species that had not only survived this environment but had thrived in it and eventually left entirely was either extraordinarily adaptable or operating on a logic that the registry's current classification system was not fully equipped to capture. I'd always found a Class 4 designation funny. We just called it home. In the briefing room, General Counsel patched through on a 12-second delay, which meant every exchange took a little longer than anyone wanted, and the pauses between questions and answers had a weight to them. Admiral Petra Vance appeared on the main screen, short, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness in her posture that came from having made enough serious decisions that she no longer felt the need to signal their seriousness with her face. I had served under Vance twice in my career, and I knew that the stillness was not calm exactly, it was control. She felt things, she simply decided what to do with them before they reached the surface. Her face this time was very serious, not frightened but serious. What we know, she said, is that the Vreth Dominion launched a coordinated offensive against the Turdan coalition. Approximately 9 days ago, the Turdan primary fleet was engaged at the Dan corridor, and was the word the Turdan relay used was annihilated. I want to be accurate about that word. Translation team confirmed it is not an approximation, it is precise. Someone in the room let out a slow breath. Secondary Accord fleets from 3 other member species attempted to respond. 2 of those fleets have since gone dark. The 3rd has confirmed retreat to their home system and has formally withdrawn from coalition engagement. Marsh's jaw was set. What do we know about the Vreth? Expansion is power on the far edge of Accord adjacent space, active for approximately 80 years. They have absorbed 31 smaller species in that time through a combination of military force and, in several cases, terms that amounted to forced absorption. This is the first time they have moved against a full registered Accord member. Vance paused. 3 separate Accord diplomatic delegations attempted contact in the first 48 hours of the offensive. None received a response. They are not interested in talking, Marsh said. They appear to have decided the conversation is finished before it began, Vance said. The room processed this in silence. The distress call went to all Accord members, every registered species, 37 recipients. We have received confirmations from 34 of them. Another pause, and in that pause I felt the weight of what was coming. 33 have formally declined to respond, citing assessment of military viability in the absence of direct territorial threat to their home systems, and the 34th is currently in session with General Counsel Vance said. And then, after a moment that she let sit exactly long enough, the vote was taken 20 minutes ago. We go, all available rapid response units, all deployable fleet assets, full operational authorization. Nobody cheered, nobody jumped up or made noise. What happened in that briefing room was quieter than that, a collective settling, a straightening of backs, the particular silence of people who have just had a decision made that each of them would have made independently if the choice had been theirs alone. I felt it in my own chest, something shifting into place, the way a weight settles when you finally pick it up instead of looking at it. Sergeant Kalashnik, Captain Marsh said without looking at me. Sir, 2 hours to get your unit prepped and on the transport deck. Yes, sir. I walked out of that briefing room and down the corridor toward the equipment bays, and I thought about the untranslatable word, the one that the AI had said meant something like willingness to enter a situation with no guaranteed exit for the benefit of others you have no prior obligation to, a concept so specific to whatever culture had coined it that no existing human word covered it. I thought the AI was wrong. I thought we had always had a word for it. We had just never needed to separate it from everything else because for us it had never been a special case. It had simply been the thing you did. They sent the distress call to every species in the Accord. Only one answered. Later a Turton diplomat would tell me that they had not truly expected a response from us. They had included humanity out of courtesy, the way you invite the newest person at a gathering, even when you do not expect them to come, because it would be wrong not to ask. They had been trying to be polite. We taken it as a promise. The Fold space transit took 11 hours. I spent most of them running gear checks, running the same checks again, and lying in my bunk looking at the ceiling and doing the mental preparation. That is not meditation exactly, but it's something close to it, the deliberate act of putting fear in its correct place, which is not away but to the side, acknowledged, set down, not the first thought. My unit was 12 soldiers, and I want to tell you about them properly because they matter to this story in ways that go beyond what they did in the engagement. Corporal Nina Hartley was 26, from Bristol in England. She had joined the USCF at 19, and in the 7 years since had become the kind of soldier who made every other soldier in her proximity quietly raise their standard. She maintained her equipment with a precision that would have impressed a machine. She had a habit of humming when she was under pressure, not songs, just tones, like a tuning process. She ran on herself automatically. I had learned in 14 months of working with her that when she stopped humming mid-task, something had genuinely surprised her, and those moments were worth paying attention to. Private Owen Graves was 22, from Cape Town, and was in the habit of asking more questions than anyone I had ever commanded, not challenging questions, not the kind that test authority for its own sake, curious ones, the kind that wanted to understand the reason behind everything, every order, every procedure, every piece of gear, every tactical decision. Some commanding officers found this irritating. I found it invaluable, because a soldier who understands the Why behind a plan is a soldier who can adapt the plan when conditions change. And conditions in combat always change. Corporal Adez Akinquo was from Lagos and had a background in xenobiological field medicine that made her, in practical terms, more capable of keeping people alive under alien conditions than anyone else on the transport. She was also quietly and without drama the moral center of the unit, the person who noticed when someone was struggling before they said so, who made sure no one carried a problem along longer than necessary. She had talked me out of 2 decisions I would have regretted over the past year, and she had done it without making me feel that I'd been talked out of anything. She had simply asked questions until I arrived at the better answer myself. I was fairly sure she did this deliberately. Sergeant Second Class Calvin Briggs was from Glasgow and had been in the USCF for 12 years, which made him the second most experienced person in the unit after me. He was large, quiet, and genuinely the most difficult person to unsettle I had ever worked with. During training scenarios, the instructors had tried various methods to break his composure and had eventually given up and made a note in his file that said, operationally unflappable, recommend frontline placement. He found this funny. Private Lena Draper was 24, from Cork in Ireland, and had been in the unit for 11 months. She had a habit of folding small figures from the foil wrappers of her ration packs and leaving them on other people's bunks, not as messages, not with any particular intent, just because she liked making things with her hands and liked the idea of other people finding small unexpected objects in their space. The common area of our transport quarters always had a few of her figures on whatever flat surface was available. A bird, a small boat, a shape that was meant to be a star and was recognizable as one if you looked at it from the right angle. The other 7 members of the unit I will not describe in full here, not because they were less important, but because some stories expand in ways that lose their shape. What I will tell you is that all 12 of us came from different parts of Earth, carried different accents and different histories and different reasons for being exactly where we were. That diversity was something the Accord found genuinely unusual. I would learn most species were considerably more uniform in appearance, in language, cultural background, and the set of experiences that shaped their fundamental understanding of the world. The Taran species had 3 regional dialects across their entire planet. The Dranasi had 1, the idea that 12 soldiers from the same planet could come from 12 effectively different cultural traditions and still function as a tightly integrated unit was, to our alien observers, nearly as confusing as our approach to tactical risk assessment. I did not find it confusing at all. I had grown up understanding that the person beside you did not need to be like you to be worth fighting. Beside, that was something Earth's long and extremely complicated history had taught us after a very great deal of argument, loss, and eventual hard-won understanding. The fold exit brought us in a Taran coalition space at the edge of the dense sector, and the first thing I saw through the viewport beside my bunk was debris, not the clean, structured kind that shows up in simulations, real debris, pieces of hull plating and structural sections turning slowly against the dark, scattered in patterns that told a story of catastrophic and sudden force. Ships that had not come apart gradually, but all at once. There's a great deal of it, and it stretched across the sector in a spread. That gave you a sense of the scale of what had happened. The way a landscape tells you about whether that is already past, that is the Taran primary fleet. Lieutenant Finn said quietly from the seat beside me. Nobody said anything. There was nothing useful to say. The U.S. CF fleet dropped out of fold over the following 40 minutes, the warships. First, then the carriers, and finally the 3 breacher platforms, which were officially classified as experimental, but had been armed and tested quietly over the previous 3 years against scenarios that everyone had hoped would remain theoretical. Admiral Vance's command ship, the Resolute, held the center of the formation, and on the secondary tactical display I could see the coalition surviving ships at their holding position near Turton Command 1 station, and I could also see from the density of the formation data compared to the Accord records of Turton fleet strength how much of it was gone. The first hail came from a Turton admiral named Coordinator Marshal Thuron, USCF fleet. We are long pause translated well enough that the hesitation came through clearly. We did not expect a response of this scale. Vance's voice came back level and unhurried. We received a distress call. We responded. How many vessels? 340. Combat ships, 6 carrier-class vessels, 3 breacher platforms, approximately 42,000 ground force personnel across the transport complement. The line went silent for 30 seconds, then a different voice, older and rougher in translation. Humans, you brought everything. We brought what we had, Vance said. There was no particular emphasis in her voice. It was simply a statement of fact, which was in itself more striking than any emphasis would have been. I was on the secondary command deck of the Irkuts when this exchange happened, and I heard the crew around me react to it in the way that said more than any celebration would have, a kind of quiet, settled recognition. Of course we brought everything. The question of bringing anything less had apparently not come up. The Turton liaison assigned to our unit was named Coordinator Shell. She came aboard the Irkutsk 4 hours after we docked at Command 1, and she was the first Turton I had seen in person rather than through communication screen. She was tall, taller than any person in my unit, with a narrow frame and 4-jointed fingers on each hand. Her skin was silver gray. Her eyes were large and positioned slightly to the side of her face, which gave her excellent peripheral vision, and which meant that from certain angles she appeared to be looking at something just past you. She wore the Turton Coordination Corps uniform, dark blue, high collar, 3 vertical stripes on the left shoulder, and she carried a data pad with the particular grip of someone who used it constantly. She stepped into our loading bay and looked at us, and I watched her work very carefully to not show that the overall picture was alarming to her in some way she had not anticipated. Coordinator Shell, I said, stepping forward. Sergeant Yeva Kalashnik, 9th Rapid. Response, welcome aboard. She looked at me, then at Owen, who was eating a nutrition bar, and immediately offered her one, which she declined with a small movement of her upper fingers that I would learn meant something close to polite thanks. Then at Nina, who had her equipment spread across a crate in 16 separate pieces and was reassembling it with absolute calm. Then at Callum, who was asleep, sitting upright against the wall, which seemed to disturb her in a way she was not certain how to articulate, then at Adiz, who was going through medical supply checks on her pad while simultaneously having a detailed conversation with Private Connor Mao about structural layout and emergency exit routes. You are all doing different things, Shell said. Yes, I said. At the same time, we find efficient. She made a note on her pad. I would learn later that this was constant. She filed observations in real time because her coordination role required documentation of everything relevant. I would also learn that her reports from the first week aboard the Irkala Grand to just under 200 pages. She attended every briefing. She said very little at first, and what she did instead was watch the way we disagree with each other openly. During planning, the way Marsh took input from junior soldiers and actually changed 2 elements of his assault plan. Based on it, the way arguments had a shape and a resolution, and ended with people more aligned than they had started rather than more resentful. She watched Callum wake up 5 minutes before an alarm, fully alert, as if sleep was simply a state he stepped into and out of deliberately. She watched Lena Draper leave a small folded figure on her assigned bunk space without explanation. Your commanding officer, she said to me. After the second briefing, he altered his plan because a private disagreed with it. Private Graves identified a problem with the Eastern access approach. Marsh agreed the problem was real and adjusted in structure. A private presenting an alternative to captain's plan without being asked would be, she considered the right word, irregular. We found that structures which cannot absorb information from the bottom tend to break in ways nobody predicted. I said we had a long time to learn that. How long? Thousands of years of trying structures that did not absorb it first. She wrote something on her pad. The strategic meeting between the human Admiralty and the Tour Command Coalition. Command took place on the station's main operations floor, and I attended as part of the security detail. What Admiral Vance proposed was not a defensive line. It was not a holding pattern. It was a push, a strike through the center of the Vreth advance to sever the supply chain at 3 critical nodes, forcing a two-front engagement and destroying the momentum of an advance that had, until now, moved in only one direction. The Turden Admiral looked at the tactical display for a long time. This requires your forces to pass through Vreth controlled space at multiple points. Thuron said, yes, they will engage you heavily at each one. We expect that. What is your acceptable casualty threshold for this operation, Admiral? Bistad did not pause. We would prefer to keep it below 30%. The silence that followed that answer was one of the longer silences I have sat in. It pressed outward from Vance like a force, touching every person in that room and making them recalculate something, not the tactics, something underneath the tactics, some assumption about what kind of species was standing in front of them. I watched Shell write something on her pad. Later I asked her what it was. She showed me. No, humans do not appear to include individual survival as a primary variable in mission planning calculus. 30% loss rate described as preferred outcome, implying acceptance of higher rates as operationally possible. Further observation required to determine whether this represents cultural conditioning, biological predisposition, or situational response to perceived Necessity, I thought it was a very accurate observation. I told her so. Plan was approved, partly because it was the best option available. Partly, I think, because we had shown up with 340 warships and an evident willingness to use them, and in that room full of people who had run out of other options, that willingness was its own kind of argument. After the meeting, Shell walked beside me back toward the docking ring. I read Human Military History last night, she said, during the transport transfer. I had access to the Accord's public records on Earth's historical conflicts. She paused. It is extensive. We kept records. You have been in a state of near continuous organized conflict for approximately 12,000 years, give or take, and you are still here, still here. She was quiet for a moment in a way that meant she was preparing to say something she had been considering for a while. You have never stopped fighting, she said. Not once. Not in all of that time. I thought about my grandmother's grandmother and the garden planted after the worst years. I thought about what keeps being rebuilt after every catastrophe. I thought about the particular human refusal to let the previous chapter be the final one. We kept getting better at it, I said. She looked at the corridor ahead of us for a long moment. That is either the most encouraging thing I have ever heard a species say about itself, she said, or the most frightening. Isma to hear. On Earth we find those two things are usually the same. She wrote something on her pad. We had 6 days before the advance. My unit had work to do and I went back to do it, but I stopped once more at the viewport near my bunk and looked at the debris field. All those pieces of the Turden fleet turning slowly in the dark, and I felt, not for the last time, the particular weight of being in the right place at the right moment, not a comfortable weight, the honest kind. Then I went to work. The Vreth did not know what to do with ships that moved toward them. I have thought about this many times since then, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. It was not that the concept of aggressive advance was unknown to them. They had practiced it themselves for 80 years. The issue was that in every engagement in their documented history, the force on the receiving end of the advance eventually made a decision: fall back, hold the line, seek terms, go quiet. Every species they had ever faced had, at some point in the engagement, reached for the exit. They hit us and we closed the distance. I was on the secondary tactical deck of the Irkutsk when the engagement started, watching the battle display with Shell positioned to my right. The Vreth formation was substantial. 83 combat vessels in a quarter position designed to channel any approaching fleet into concentrated fire. It was a sound strategy. It had worked 31 times before. The U.S. fleet divided into 8 assault groups and 1 feint formation before the engagement reached weapons range. The feint, 40 ships with high visible energy output and an aggressive approach vector, pulled Vreth targeting toward the far left. The actual push was through the center and the right. 8 groups moving fast, angled to force the Vreth line to extend beyond its design parameters. They're splitting, Shell said. 8 groups in a feint, I said. How do you know which one is the feint? Because if I were running this engagement, that is the one I would make look most real. The Vreth line extended. Then it buckled in the center. 2 Vreth vessels broke formation to address the pressure from the right flank, which created a gap in the center that 3 human ships moved through. immediately, as if they had been waiting for exactly that gap, because they had because the plan had accounted for it. The Irkutsk took its first hit 12 minutes in. It came from the port side and hit with a force that I felt as a shudder through the deck and the walls, and the seat I gripping, a sensation like being struck by something very large that was moving at a speed that had no natural equivalent. The lights flickered, damage alerts activated on the displays around me, hull breach on Deck 7, compartment sealed, the operations officer said in a tone that would have been appropriate for reading a weather report. Structural integrity at 91%. Weapon systems nominal, propulsion at full, continuing advance. Those last 2 words, I have thought about them often, not because they were dramatic. They were not delivered with any drama, and they were not meant to be. They were simply accurate. The breach was contained. The ship was functional. Mission was ongoing, so you continued. That was the logic of it, and on a ship crewed by human beings who had made the relevant decisions before they ever boarded, it required no particular discussion. There was no moment of collective agreement. There was just a next thing happening in sequence, because that was what forward motion looked like. Shell gripped the edge of the console in front of her. She was not in danger. We were not taking damage that threatened her directly, but the shudder of a strike and the sound of alerts and the sight of breach reports was clearly something she was working to process. You are okay, I said, not because I had any way of certifying it exactly, but because it was true in the way that mattered. She was unhurt. The ship was functioning, and we were moving forward. I know, she said, and then, after a few seconds, I know, like saying it twice helped her locate it. I respected that more than I could explain. To be in this situation without the background of 10,000 years of it being considered acceptable was its own particular kind of difficulty. The supply chain severance was the primary objective, and it was working while the fleet engagement held the breath. Attention, my unit went down to the first surface target at hour 3 of the engagement, not a planet but a breath logistics relay station, approximately the size of a large building complex floating in an intersection of 2 transit corridors. 41 breath crew, supply link controls, and a data system that connected to 6 other nodes across the advance front. If we disable this one, the cascade effect on the supply structure would be significant. Owen Graves had identified the entry point during the structural briefing 3 days earlier. An emergency access port on the station's underside designed for maintenance crews, not built to be a defensive concern because it had never needed to be. No one had ever reached this station from the exterior uninvited. Owen had been the one looking at the schematic from an angle no one else had been looking from, asking the question that no one else had thought to ask yet. We went in through the underside. The breath inside were large. I want to give you an accurate picture of this rather than an exaggerated one. They averaged around 2 m and 40 cm in height, with a body density consistent with adaptation to a high-gravity home world. Their natural physical strength significantly exceeded a human's at comparable size. Their reaction time was good. Their coordination armor was effective in an open space against opponents who engaged in a way their doctrine expected. They were formidable. Close quarters were Different, humanity had spent an uncomfortable amount of its history fighting other humans in corridors, rooms and urban structures and caves, in every kind of confined space that geography and necessity had ever produced. We had developed through this long and largely regrettable experience a set of instincts and techniques for exactly these conditions, for the chaos of tight spaces, for the way size becomes less of an advantage when the ceiling is low and every turn brings a new decision with a half-second window, for the psychological pressure of confined space engagement that is different in kind from open combat. Addies had briefed us on breath physiology and stress responses in detail. Nina had run the contingency drill 3 times on the transport. Owen had memorized the station layout to the point where he could direct movement through it without a display. We cut the lighting in the first 40 seconds. I will not describe the engagement moment by moment because the tactical specifics matter less than what they added up to. We took the station in 14 minutes. We disabled the logistics links. We extracted data from the system before destroying it. We did our work and we left. 2 of my unit were injured. Neither injury was life-threatening. Addies had both of them stable before we were back aboard the Irkutsk because she had anticipated the specific risks and had prepared for them with the same systematic thoroughness that she brought to every medical situation. Her preparation was its own kind of strength, the kind that does not look like strength until it is the exact thing that is needed. The change in breath behavior started becoming visible in the data around hour 6. Their response times were degrading. Formation integrity was down. 3 separate breath commanders had requested permission to pull back to defensive positions and 2 of them had done so before authorization came through, which told you something about the state of the Central Command authority over its own forces. JIPs were querying Central Command for guidance at a rate that was measurably higher than the engagement's opening hours. 1 breath fleet commander had repositioned entirely to a location that made no tactical sense for offensive action, but a clear amount of sense if you were thinking about what came after the offensive. They were checking their exits. And GT snorts. And GT, you have broken their pattern, Shell said, watching the display. We have not done anything they have not seen before. I said, advance, disrupt supply lines, maintain pressure. None of this is new. It is new, she said, when no species that has faced them has been willing to keep doing it. I thought about the 33 species that had declined the distress call. I had been careful in thinking about this, not to judge that decision. Fear is a rational response to genuine threat, and the breath had given every species in the Accord real and documented reasons to take the threat seriously. 33 different peoples had looked at the same information we had looked at and arrived at a different answer. I understood that calculation. I even understood it sympathetically. We had looked at the same information and asked a different question, not what our chances, but if not us, then who? And the answer to that, in the quiet, after 33 separate answers of no, was no. 1. I lost 2 people that day, and I'm going to tell you this plainly. Corporal Neville Ashworth was from Edinburgh. He was 28 years old and had been in the USCF for 6 years and had a gift for languages. That meant he had already learned the basics of Torvan and was working on Trinity phonetics in his spare time. He thought this was funny, that he could learn alien languages faster than he had ever learned French. In school, he died when a secondary explosion tore through the station section where he was holding a rear security position. Private Lena Draper was 24 from Cork. She was in the medical bay, stable after the initial treatment ADAs had given her when a system failure in a compromised section caused a depressurization event that the emergency seals were 3 seconds too slow to prevent. She had been in the unit for 11 months. She had left 6 small folded figures in various places around the Irkutsk that I kept finding for weeks. Afterward, I wrote their names in my log. That is what I do. I write the names and I keep the record, because the names belong somewhere permanent, and I am the one responsible for putting them there. Ades sat with me afterward, not trying to fix anything, not offering comfort in the form of words, just present in the way that some people know how to be present without requiring that you perform being okay. After a while she said, we held the position. I said they did their part. They did. We sat in the hum of the ship for a while longer, and then we both got up, because the mission was ongoing and there was more to do. And the mission being ongoing was not a way of dismissing what had happened. It was simply the logic of where we were and what we had agreed to before we ever left Bravo 7, and accepting the logic of it did not make it painless, but it made it possible to keep moving, which was what the situation required. The Vreth Dominion had conquered 31 species. They had 80 years of data on what species did when faced with overwhelming force. They had models. They had patterns. They had a clear and well-documented understanding of how rational beings behaved when the cost of resistance appeared to exceed the expected benefit. What they did not have, what nothing in their history had produced, was us, not because we were reckless, not because we did not understand the arithmetic. We understood it clearly. We had done the same calculations they expected us to do, and we had arrived at the same numbers. We had simply looked at those numbers and asked a question that their models had no category for. And what if we do it anyway? The Vreth had no answer for that question. They were still looking for one. We continued the advance. 7 days into the campaign, the Vreth stopped fighting the way they had always fought. The chain showed up in aggregate before it showed up in any single action. Response times at the fleet level were running 18% slower than the engagement's opening days. 3 commanders had moved to defensive positions without being ordered to. Intelligence intercepts showed internal Vreth communications using language that the translation team flagged as high urgency and out of pattern with their standard operational tone. They were not retreating, but they were recalculating. And for a force that had spent 80 years winning without needing to recalculate, that was a visible change. Captain Marsh showed me the analysis in his office. With Shell present, she had become a regular part of our operational discussions by this point, not because her role required it, but because she had simply started showing up and contributing things that were useful, and none of us had had any reason to change that arrangement. Their doctrine is based on a model of opponent behavior, she said, studying the data. The model has a built-in assumption about the ceiling on aggression and the floor on self-preservation, your forces have exceeded one and are apparently ignoring the other. We are not ignoring it, I said. We have placed it lower in the order. How much lower? As low as the situation requires. She wrote something on her pad. Marsh pointed to a cluster of formation data, the supply line. Disruption is the key change. They built their advance on the assumption of continuous resupply from the rear. We cut that assumption at 3 points. Now, everything they do forward costs more than a budgeted for. They're spending reserves, I said, not just ships. Confidence. Shell looked at me. Can you run out of confidence? Any species can. The question is what it takes. She thought about that. The shift in the broader coalition happened more slowly and looked different, less like a decision and more like a tide turning. Things that had been moving one way, beginning quietly to move another way. Species that had gone dark started requesting operational updates. Drenethi fleet that had been holding position 7 sectors back filed a formal request to re-enter the operational zone. 2 Terran vessels that had been running support missions only formally requested reintegration into combat formations. Admiral Vance did not make a speech about it. She updated the order of battle to include them as if their return was something she had planned for, which I suspect she had in the quiet particular way that very good commanders plan for the outcome they intend to produce without announcing it. The Drenethi fleet leader, a methodical being named Osrin, contacted the Resolute to formally rejoin. He was large gray-green with a domed head and a bearing that suggested he was someone who thought before he acted and thought carefully. He was also clearly in a state of dignified discomfort, embarrassed, not ashamed. There is a difference, but aware that he was returning to a place he had left and that this required acknowledgement. Admiral Vance, he said, the Drenethi delegation has reviewed the operational data from the past 7 days. We wish to reinstate our commitment to the coalition effort. We welcome you back, fleet leader. We had assessed the probability of successful resistance as below viable threshold. I understand. Vance said. A pause. How did you assess it? What calculation produced a different result? Vance considered this for a moment. We approached it from a different direction, she said. We did not ask what our chances were. We asked what happened if no one tried, and the answer to that second question was less acceptable. Osrin was quiet, and the second outcome was less acceptable to you than the cost of attempting the first by a significant margin, Vance said. After the call ended and Ostrin's fleet began moving toward the operational zone, I stood at the edge of the bridge thinking about that exchange. It was not a complicated idea. If no one tries, what happens? But applying it, actually running it through the full machinery of self-preservation and rational cost-benefit thinking required something that those systems did not automatically supply: the willingness to let that question sit in the room longer than the fear did, the willingness to make it the last word rather than the first. That was the peace that had always been the peace the Vreth made their political move on the 9th day. It arrived as a formal diplomatic transmission, their first since the offensive began, addressed not to the Taran Coalition High Command, not to the Accord's Joint Leadership Council, but directly to the Earth General Council. It had clearly been translated In haste, the language slightly awkward. In places in ways that the accords. Standard transmission usually was not. The content was this: Vreth forces would withdraw from all currently occupied Terran coalition space, all held systems would enter a transitional status to be defined through subsequent negotiation. A communication pause of 30 standard days would be observed while terms were finalized. In exchange, human forces would stand down immediately and take no further part in the engagement. Shell brought me the translated text and watched my face as I read it. I read it twice. The logic was obvious enough. Remove the element that had changed the equation. Without the human forces driving the operational momentum, the coalition reverted to the state it had been in before we arrived, demoralized, structurally compromised, lacking the kind of forward pressure that forced the Vreth to fight on multiple terms. Simultaneously, the other species, however willing, would fall back into the defensive patterns that the Vreth understood and knew how to counter. It was a reasonable calculation. The only problem was what it assumed about us. They think you can be bought out, Shell said, not with surprise exactly, with a particular careful flatness of someone watching a test being administered to see what it reveals. I know they have identified the human forces as the variable and are attempting to remove the variable, yes, by offering something that satisfies your interest without requiring them to stop. That is what they think our interests are, I said. The response from the Earth General Council arrived 6 hours later. 6 hours from a message received on a station at the edge of Turdan space, transmitted to a planet on the far side of its solar system, into a council chamber that was almost certainly in the middle of the night for half its members, deliberated and returned across interstellar space to where we were sitting. 6 hours for sentences. The Earth General Council has received the Vreth Dominion's transmission. We do not accept the offer terms. Our position is as follows: unconditional withdrawal from all occupied Accord systems and cessation of all hostile action or continuation of current military engagement. No further terms will be considered. No diplomatic raiders. No back-channel implications. No offer of a modified arrangement or conversation about modifications. 4 sentences, complete and final, in the same register that you would use to state a fact. Shell read it twice. Then she set it down. Then she looked at me for a long moment. Why, she said, genuinely, not critically. She actually wanted to understand. I thought about how to answer it. They asked for help, I said. Whoever sent that signal, they asked, and we said yes. That is the whole of it, but the terms were not unfavorable. Vreth forces leave turn in space. The primary objective was not the primary objective, I said. Helping was the primary objective. Vreth forces leaving turn in space is what success looks like, but it is not why we came. We came because someone asked, and yes was the right word. Shell was quiet. You cannot say yes and then negotiate. What yes means, I said, that changes what yes is. On Earth we have a word for people who do that, and it is not a compliment. She picked up her pad. She wrote for a long time. Later, much later, she told me what she had written. She had written that she had spent her career studying species interaction and diplomatic behavior, and that she had never encountered a species whose commitments functioned as fixed points. rather than negotiating positions. That she had initially interpreted this as strategic, that humans were maintaining a position because deviation was costly, that she had come to understand over the previous 9 days. That was not strategic at all, that for us the commitment was the point, not the means to a point. That yes meant yes, in a way that was for us not a policy, but a definition. She had ended the entry with a note to herself: review all prior assessments of human motivation. Previous frameworks are inadequate. I found that note when she showed it to me to be the most accurate thing anyone had written about us in the entire span of the engagement. The Vreth Political Council, according to intelligence intercepts compiled over the following days, spent a considerable amount of time attempting to identify what the humans actually wanted, the thing that would move us, the offer that would reframe the calculation. They modeled economic incentives, territorial arrangements, technology exchanges, security guarantees. They ran analysis on Earth-stated resource needs, population distribution, strategic adjacency interests, and historical conflict patterns. They found nothing that worked, not because we had no interests, but because none of our interests were the kind that could be satisfied by abandoning people who had asked for our help. The Vreth analysts were working from a framework in which every action has a transactional root, in which every commitment is ultimately an expression of calculated self-interest that can be redirected by a better calculation. From that framework, human behavior in this engagement was genuinely inexplicable. They filed a report describing our decision-making as, in the closest translation the intelligence team could produce, motivationally opaque. Species appears to operate from framework that does not respond to standard leverage analysis. Shell showed me this translation and waited. I think they meant it as a criticism. I said, it may be the most accurate thing they have produced about you in the entire engagement. She said, I thought about that for a while. Motivationally opaque, meaning we cannot figure out what you want, meaning our tools for understanding why things do what they do not work on you, meaning you're a variable we cannot model. I've been called worse. The Vreth committed their reserve fleet to a decisive engagement at a strategic junction called Shurath Station, the last significant control node before the Turdan Coalition's core systems. If they held it, they controlled access to everything that mattered. If they lost it, the campaign was over. They were not making this decision from confidence. They were making it because the alternatives had run out, and this was the move that remained. Their reserve fleet was approximately 220 vessels. We had 281 ships still in active configuration, plus the reformed coalition elements coming in from multiple directions. Numbers were not wildly mismatched. This was not a story of impossible odds overcome. It was a story of two forces meeting at a point that both sides knew mattered, and the question being which side was more willing to hold that point when holding became expensive. That question, in my experience, is how most important things are decided, not strategy, not numbers, not even technology in most cases. Willingness, the commitment to keep going when going is difficult. We have been practicing that for as long as we have been a species that kept records of what it practiced. The night before we moved on Shiraz Station, a transmission came from Fleet Leader Osborne aboard the Drenethi. Carrier, it was addressed to Admiral Vance but copied to all senior Coalition commanders. Fleet Leader Osborne Drenethi Combined Forces 2. Admiral Vance USCF, I have reviewed the available engagement projections for Shiraz Station. I wish to formally request that Drenethi forces be positioned at the forward edge of the assault formation. Vance replied, within the hour. Request granted. Fleet Leader welcome to the front. I read this in the common area of the Irkutsk, and Sho was sitting across from me, and I watched her read it too. They want to be at the front, she said quietly. They want to be where it matters. She looked at the message for a moment longer. A week ago they were pulling back. People change their minds when they see what is possible, I said. When someone shows them that the question has a different answer than the one they thought. She was quiet for a long time, her pad on the table in front of her, not writing anything. Then she said, is that what you have been doing? All of you this entire campaign, just showing everyone else a different answer to the same question? I thought about it honestly. I do not know if we planned it that way. We answered it the way we always answer. We just happened to be somewhere the answer mattered. She looked at the table between us. The Vreth had a word, she told me, a term from their internal communications flagged by the intelligence team. The closest translation was something like an infestation that does not respond to conventional deterrence calculations, something that does not register when it is supposed to stop. They have been using this word to describe the human forces in operational warnings to their commanders. They meant it as a threat classification, she said. I know it is probably the most precise thing they have said about your species in this entire engagement on Earth, I said. We would consider that a reasonable description of what happens when you ask us nicely and then try to make a stop. She almost smiled. I'd been learning her expressions by that point, and I was fairly certain that was what it was. We moved on Shiraz Station at dawn. Station time, all forces for position. Full engagement. The Vreth Reserve Fleet was waiting, so were we. I landed on Shiraz Station in a drop pod. That had not been the plan. The original arrangement had me with my unit aboard one of the transport ships making the secondary approach from below. That approach became impossible when the transport took a direct hit from a Vreth long-range weapon 12 minutes into the engagement, and the entire secondary bay lost function. My pod was the only vehicle still operational. The option was the pod or nothing. I took the pod. It hit the station hall at a speed that the engineers would later describe as within survivable parameters. I know this because I survived. Whether the experience was comfortable is a different question, and I'm not going to claim that it was. I went through an existing breach in the exterior plating, struck a structural support on the inside, and came to rest against a power relay housing with a noise that I suspected was audible in the operational zone. I sat still for 4 seconds and ran an inventory of what was working. Everything was working. I had a bruise that would be notable and a cut above my left eye. Those were the damages. I climbed out and started moving. Station's interior was large, built as a logistics coordination hub with long transit corridors connecting storage sections, a command center at the upper level, and auxiliary systems that controlled everything from communications to the docking mechanisms that the Wraith were using to maintain their supply network. My objective, revised in real time, was to reach the Central Command Relay and disable it. Without my unit, without support, navigating from schematics that had been built from surveillance data and were accurate in layout but not in the details that actual presence would have. Filled in, I moved carefully and I adapted as I went. I want to describe this accurately rather than dramatically. What you do in a situation like this is not heroic exactly. It is a long series of small decisions, each one depending on the one before it, which corridor, which speed, when to stop and listen, when to move fast before the opportunity closes. These decisions do not look impressive as a list. They look like a person walking through a building, paying attention and making adjustments. That is what they are. Some of them is what determines the outcome. I found a Central Command Relay 41 minutes after my pod hit the hull. There were 3 Wraith crew members in the relay room. What followed was difficult, I will say that plainly, and not dress it up. It required everything I had and left me with an additional injury to my right shoulder that Adez would later in her medical notes describe as technically unnecessary, meaning I had used an approach that was more aggressive than efficiency required. She was right, and when she told me this, I told her she was right, and she nodded in the manner of someone who had expected this response and was satisfied by it. The relay went down at 14:37 station time. 42 seconds later, the Wraith fleet began losing coordinated targeting data. The gap was not total. Their backup systems compensated for the most critical functions, but the disruption to centralized coordination was significant enough. Admiral Vance's fleet had been waiting. When the relay signal dropped, the Joint Command pressed the advantage, and the full weight of 281 ships and reformed coalition forces hit the Wraith reserve at a moment when their response coordination was running on backup. I sat on the floor of the relay room and ate the last of the ration bar from my jacket pocket and waited for extraction to find me. The Battle of Shiraz Station ran for 19 hours. I say this without drama because 19 hours does not sound like a dramatic number. It sounds like a long time to be doing something difficult and then stopping, but the shape of those 19 hours and what they contained, the decisions made and the cost paid and the things held and the things lost, made them in the scale of what the Accord could track across its member species. The most consequential 19 hours in 200 years of shared history. The result was a transmission received by Admiral Vance aboard the Resolute, forwarded to all coalition commanders, logged in the Accord's operational records. The Wraith reserve fleet was withdrawing, not retreating in the military sense, with the implied pause before regrouping, withdrawing, which in the breadth of own diplomatic communications carried the specific weight of ending an engagement with no intention of immediate resumption. They were done. Formally, the terms came 3 days later. Full withdrawal from all occupied Accord systems, ceasefire of indefinite duration. The status of the 31 previously absorbed species would be addressed through a process that would take years and would not be simple and would not produce clean or complete outcomes for a long time. What those peoples had that they had not had a Month earlier was a starting position. Rather than a concluded end, that is not. Everything it is not close to. Everything, but it is the beginning of. Everything and beginnings are the one thing you cannot make without getting there first. The observation bay on Shiraz Station had taken damage in the engagement, but the viewport was intact. And that was where I went when my operational duties were completed and the D's had finished addressing my shoulder and declared me, in her precise language, no more compromised than your baseline shell was there when I arrived. She was sitting in the far seat looking out at the viewport, and she did not turn around when I came in. I sat beside her and looked out too. Rescue ships were moving through the debris in slow, careful arcs. Coalition vessels were reforming their lines. Trinity carrier was rotating on its axis while its crew ran damage assessment. The debris was extensive. Every direction. Not just REF ships, but ours and coalition ships, and the physical record of 19 hours of people holding a point that mattered from far enough away. That point looked very small. That is always true of important things. I've been working on my report, Shell said after a while. How was it going? I keep running out of existing frameworks, she said. Every framework I have for understanding species behavior was built for something other than you. She looked at the viewport. I may need to build a new one. What would it be called? She thought about this seriously. I think it would need to start from a different premise. Most frameworks start by asking what a species is: physical characteristics, biological adaptations, historical development, cultural structures. Then they use those inputs to predict behavior. She paused. For your species, all of those inputs are present, and they are interesting, but they do not predict the behavior that actually matters. The behavior that matters seems to come from something else. What you decide, she said, not what you are, what you decide to be. I looked at the rescue ships moving through the debris. Can I ask you something? I said, yes. Are you afraid of us? She took this seriously, the way she took most things seriously, and she gave it a real pause before answering, the kind of pause that means the question is being held and turned over and examined honestly. I was, she said finally, at the beginning, not of what you would do to us. You had come to help us, but afraid of what it meant. That a species like yours existed, that something produced by a world that tried to kill everything on it had not been limited by that, but had become. She gestured outward at the operation, at the whole 19 days, too large, too far outside everything I understood. It felt like something that should not be possible. And now I think I was asking the wrong question. I was asking what you are. I should have been asking what you decided. And what did we decide? She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a turden vessel moved past the viewport, its crew lit in the windows, doing the long, careful work of assessment and repair that comes after the part everyone remembers. You decided that the universe was worth showing up for, she said, even when it cost something, even when no one required you to. She looked at me, even when 33 other species looked at the exact same situation and made a different decision. I thought about that. We were afraid too, I said. I want to be clear about that. My unit was afraid. The fleet was afraid. The people who voted in the council chamber were afraid. Fear was present for all of it. Then what was different? We decided that fear got to speak, I said, but it did not get to Finish the sentence. I went home for 3 weeks before the next deployment. Home. Not the base, not a transit station, but the specific piece of earth where I had grown up, the stretch where the winters lasted long and the permafrost went deep, and the sky in early spring had a particular pale quality that I had never seen reproduced anywhere else. My daughter Nina was 7 years old and had inherited the gene, if that is what it is, that makes certain humans constitutionally unable to be still when they could be moving. Instead, she spent the first 2 days running me through every corner of the house and showing me things she had learned and made and discovered since I'd last been home. I absorbed all of it. I wanted all of it. On the 3rd day it snowed, light enough season snow that would be gone by the afternoon, and she went outside immediately in her coat and her boots and her gloves and stood in the open yard with her arms wide and her face turned up to the sky and the flakes coming down around her. She was not doing anything practical. She was not building anything or going anywhere. She was just standing in it, being in it, completely with her full attention and no reservation. I watched her from the window. I thought about the signal at 3:14 station time. I thought about 33 species who had received the same signal and made a reasonable calculation. I thought about Neville Ashworth from Edinburgh and Lena Draper from Cork and the names I wrote in my log that belonged somewhere permanent. I thought about Shell with her pad full of observations, and the moment she had put the pad down and just looked, I thought about Owen Graves asking questions from every angle until he found the one that mattered. I thought about the untranslatable word, the one that meant something like entering a situation with no guaranteed exit for the benefit of others you have no obligation to, and I thought about the AI that had said no human word covered it. I thought the AI was still wrong. I thought we had always had that word. We had just never needed it to be separate from the ordinary act of being who we were. The Galactic Accord held a formal session 3 weeks after Shira Station. I was not present. I was on a hospital vessel having my shoulder treated properly while Adiz supervised the process with a careful intensity she brought to all medical situations she considered insufficiently addressed. But Shell attended and she sent me a detailed summary afterward, because by that point we had the kind of friendship where detailed summaries were something she knew I would want. No Sit Amani, no Douglas Sheehan, no member of the council gave a speech. What happened was an administrative action, a change to the Accord's official member registry, the entry that had listed humanity as Class 4 Death World Primitive, Minor Member Limited. Strategic relevance was revised. The new category had existed in the registry for 400 years without ever having been applied. It had been created by one of the Accord's founding species as a theoretical designation, not for species that were powerful or technologically advanced or strategically important, but for something that the founders had apparently considered worth having a category for, even though no species had ever qualified for it, or perhaps the circumstances for qualification had simply never arisen. The category was listed in the Accord's registry as unconditional allies. The vote to reclassify was unanimous. The Accord secretary noted in the official record that the Turden delegate who moved the reclassification had needed to pause twice while making the motion. The Secretary noted that this was the first time in the Accord's 400 years of formal sessions that a routine administrative reclassification had been accompanied by what the record described as visible emotional response from the chamber floor. I read Shell's summary in my hospital bed with my shoulder in a repair casing and a cup of coffee that was for once genuinely warm. I read it, and then I set it down and I sat with it for a while, not thinking about it exactly, just letting it be what it was. Unconditional allies, a category that had existed empty for 400 years, waiting for something that fitted. We had not set out to fill it, we had set out to answer a question that someone asked us. At 3:14 in the dark, the category was just what happened to a word for what we already were. My daughter turned around and saw me through the window and waved with her whole arm, the enthusiastic wave of someone who does not calibrate how much expression to use and has no reason to. I waved back, then I put on my coat and went outside. The snow was light and it was still coming down, and she came running toward me across the yard, and I caught her, and the cold was the kind that you feel in your lungs when you breathe it in, sharp and clean and real. The sky was pale. The light was thin, but it was there, the particular early spring light that meant a long part was over and something else was beginning. After 19 days of everything that comes with the decision we made, all the cost and the distance and the particular prices paid, this was the other side of the equation. Not a reward, not compensation, just a thing that was always there on the far end of every difficult thing, waiting to be returned to. The ordinary joy that is available only to beings who keep coming back to it. They sent the distress call to every species in the Accord. 37 recipients, 33 declining answers, all of them reasonable, all of them the result of real calculation by real beings looking at a real and frightening situation. One answer of yes, not because we had run better numbers, not because we had less to lose, not because we were reckless or did not understand the weight of what we were agreeing to. We understood the weight. We had loaded 340 ships and 42,000 people onto the other side of the scale, and we knew exactly what that meant. We said yes because someone asked, and because we had decided somewhere in the 12,000 years of argument and loss and rebuilding and trying again and getting it wrong and getting up and doing the work again. That yes meant yes, that when you said it you meant all of it, that the alternative, saying something that looked like yes but was really a calculation dressed in yes clothing, was not something we could do and still be who we were. They got us, Deathworlders, raised on a planet that had never once offered safety as a default, a species that had come through every impossible thing their world produced. Not by becoming fearless, we were never fearless, but by deciding again and again that fear did not get to finish the sentence. Not stronger than everything we faced, not always smarter, not immune to cost or loss or the weight of names written in logs by the people responsible for keeping them, just stubbornly, persistently, irreversibly committed to showing up when the question was asked, just unwilling to let the universe's silence be the final answer when there was still something we could do about it, just us, exactly us. And for once in all the long and careful history of a galaxy that had learned to look after itself first and calculate second and act only when the numbers were right, that was exactly enough.